appreciate that Zach asked me, about a month ago, he gave me a call asking if I'd be able to speak on the 18th and talk about Genesis chapter 50. I wasn't able to get right back with him because I wasn't sure if I was going to be in town or not, because we were making plans to go to see Rachel, and luckily it's next weekend for us, and that I get to be here this morning. So let me explain the title to you a little bit, just so that we know that we're on the same page. Forgiveness, and we're going to see forgiveness in Genesis 50, but it's not just forgiveness that Genesis 50 is about. Because when you read about it, there's kind words that are also shared there. And then we're going to talk about the results, which are amazing results that God is able to do with His people when we get out of our own way and let God's way serve. We're going to see amazing results. So this morning in the order of worship, there is Genesis 50 there that we'll be reading from. And also, if you get a chance during the week on the back page, something that I had read that had touched me this week that I just put in there about learning to forgive. There's a small article there about learning to forgive. Amazing example. I don't know. Wow. I pray God touches my spirit in the same way as we go forth as we read that. So let's start this morning by looking at Genesis chapter 50. We're going to start in verse in verse 15 this morning. Now you got to remember, we'll get to that. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So here, you have 11 brothers that are fearful of what Joseph is going to do to them, fearful of what he might do or cause to them. And he goes ahead and says that we get their feelings. But we have to ask ourselves, what was the wrong that they did? Well, earlier in Genesis we can find out that kind of Joseph was hated by his brothers. Yes, I'll use the word hated by his brothers. Why? Well, according to Genesis 37:2, he was a tattletale. He told on his brothers about something, and that really, they didn't like it. In Genesis 37, again, verses 3 and 4, his dad kind of had favoritism towards him. Oh, brothers don't like that. And then, in Genesis 37, again, following 5 through 7, the interpretation of the dreams that he had about how he was going to be greater than they were. And then, when we get to in chapter 37. Now, I have a sister, and I love her dearly, but when I was 13, she hit me in the elbow with a rock, and I still have bone chips there, and I think about, how bad was I that she had to throw a rock at me? But how bad was Joseph that they had to do what they were about to do to him? So, in Genesis 37, if we read that, and if we were going to, but you can read later, we see that they sold them into slavery. Now, in 21 to 22, we see that Reuben really initially spared him and intended to free him. And then we see Judah spares him from death, and he's the one that, instead of killing him, instead of, we'll just fake it, take it back there, and let's just sell them into slavery. Your brothers got to be angry at you to be able to be sold into slavery. And not only that, knowing that he was Dad's son that was greatly loved. The hurt that they were able to cause upon their own father in all of this. But again, it's not about the 11 sons, and technically, as we look at Genesis, it's not about Joseph. It's about God and how God was. But here we are. We look at what happened to Joseph, all of these things, and we might think that such ill treatment, and then being separated from his family, his countrymen, would produce some bitterness and some hopelessness that when he had the chance, he would get back at them. Well, that doesn't happen. And not only that, Joseph, when he gets to Egypt, he rises in power, and he serves as best as he can in the house of Potiphar. Gets falsely accused of doing something wrong and chasing after her. He gets falsely accused, he gets forgotten by men, gets thrown in jail. We still might wonder, why bother to be righteous? If all of these bad things are happening to me, why bother to be righteous? But Joseph knew that he wasn't forgotten by God. He knew that he was a man of integrity. So, just as he had found favor in Potiphar's life, he finds favor in Pharaoh and brings him out of jail. So we have Joseph living as second in charge of all of Egypt. And that's the position he's in when we see him here in Genesis 50. And the brothers are rightfully so concerned. What if he holds a grudge against us? Do you get the weight of how these brothers are feeling? The weight, the guilt that they're feeling. The understanding that we did something wrong. Now Dad's gone, and boy, is brother going to let us have it. That's what they're going into. They're so worried that their brother is going to let them have it, and that they're going to be nothing. Well, let's see as we continue to read here in Genesis. So they sent word to Joseph, saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. But let's think about how Joseph had already mercifully treated his own brothers. In Genesis 42, when he's finally reunited with his brothers and his father, there are hugs all around, and there's great joy. In Genesis 46, Joseph arranges for his father and all of his relatives and that tribe to come live in Goshen. He also, in Genesis 45, reassures his brothers that he is forgiven them. In verse 45, chapter 45, when he first reveals himself to him, and now, as we're going to read, when their father dies, he's going to reassure them that he's truthful, that he's a man of character, that he is someone that understands forgiveness and kind words equal amazing results for God. Joseph wept. Why would he weep? I think it's because he hadn't gotten through to his brothers. He hadn't really made them understand how much he has forgiven them, and that they don't need to worry about it. I don't know about you, but when somebody forgives me, I tend to beat myself up more than they do. And I'm sure I need forgiveness from many of you for things that I may or may not know about. But I'll tell you, when somebody says you're forgiven, there's a relief. But then when somebody shares kind words about you, there's a greater understanding of now how our relationship is. How things that, yes, we are now back on terms that we can understand and work together. And Joseph was trying to do that, and was doing that with his brothers. And as we look here, he wept, and in verse 18, his brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. They are willing to crawl on the ground and do anything that Joseph wants. We sold you into slavery, and now we understand that the rightful thing for us is now to be your slaves. We will do anything you want. Boy, sometimes that's tempting for us when somebody comes groveling before us. And we might, well, how can we make them feel worse? You know, they did it wrong to me. I felt bad. Well, how do I get them to feel like I did? That crosses through my mind sometimes. I got to be honest. Doesn't appear to cross through Joseph's mind. It only appears to do what God wants to him. That God wants to be done. Joseph doesn't think about that. It doesn't take them up in verse 19. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" Now, I think this is a key for understanding forgiveness. I think this is a huge key for understanding. It doesn't matter what I do, God forgives. But what I do can help the results that God's going to turn out. Because here Joseph may not have. Let's just take, for example, Zach posed this question to me, and I thought it was a great one. What would happen if Joseph hadn't forgiven his brothers? Well, I'll tell you, our Bible would be totally different. Now, God would have raised up somebody to create his word and make it happen, but it would be totally different. It wouldn't read as what Joseph did. We might still hear Joseph not forgiving his brothers, and then how God rose somebody else up to bring the line through to Christ. But Joseph understood his service was to God and not himself. He understood that in his life. How do we get to understand that we are here to serve God and not be about our own business? Difficult at times, but I think the key is to understand verse 19. Am I in the place of God? I'm not in the place of God, but my actions can help others to see God in a way that words cannot. Because in verse 20, and I think verse 20 sums up all of Genesis. Verse 20 sums up what God was about in the book of Genesis. That you intended to harm me. You intended to harm me. Yeah, that was no doubt in his mind they intended to harm him. There's no doubt in Genesis that they intended to harm him. But God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. We've got to remember when wrongs are done to us, they might be intentional. They may not be intentional. But we've got to understand that God can use that to save many lives if we're able to get out of the way. If we're able to let God's work be accomplished, many lives can be saved. Really, in verse 20, Joseph is telling us that God can make good things come out of evil intentions. It happens today, folks, in our lives. There are times that we do things that are wrong, but God can use them to create great things. And I think the formula I see here from Genesis 50, forgiveness plus the kind words that Joseph shares equal amazing results for God. What are those amazing results? I think that God will keep his promises that he's made to his people that we see later in this chapter. And a reassurance to the brothers in verse 21. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children an And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. There's an aspect of forgiveness that isn't just about forgiving. It's about finding that avenue to treat that person as your brother and sister again, and to share kind words. I think when we're able to share kind words and kind actions, that's when they're able to really understand forgiveness has been granted. Joseph and his brothers don't understand it up till this point because they're still worried after Dad dies that he's going to hold a grudge. But Joseph is trying to reassure them that kind words, that through his kind words, that they are truly forgiven. And let's take a look at the other books of the Bible and the amazing results that happen because of what Joseph is able to do. We see the string of great things that happen, that God is able to keep his promises because people are willing to get out of the way. So what's the conclusion of thinking about forgiveness plus kind words equal amazing results? I think in the life of Joseph, we see the value of being someone who can learn to forgive. So I think there's 5 things that Joseph was able to do, 5 parts of his character that was able to make this happen. One is his faith was centered on God. His faith is centered and his trust is on God. Number 2, he was devoted to serving God with honor. Number 3, he was unwilling to be deterred by hatred and betrayal. He was unwilling to allow others to affect his relationship with God. Number 4, he was willing to forgive the wrongs that others had done. Well, I'll tell you, when you're able to get rid of those wrongs, what a burden is taken off of you. When you're able to get over the wrongs that others have done, what a relief from you. And number 5, and this I think is the hardest for me, and probably the hardest for all of us. Joseph's able to see the big picture. He's able to see God's merciful, wonderful workings in the affairs of men and not be caught in the details of the moment. I think if we're able to do those 5 things also in our lives, we're going to see that forgiveness and kind words equal amazing results in our lives and in the life of the church. So it will be my prayer that the example of Joseph's forgiveness and kind words will serve to inspire us to develop these 5 characters that we talked briefly at the end about Joseph. That we're going to be centered on faith, that we're going to be devoted to serving God, we're going to be unwilling to be deterred by hatred and betrayal, we're going to willingly forgive, and we're going to be able to get God's big picture. I want to conclude with 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12. I have it written down here, but I just want to read it out of here. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12. And I want to take out the aspect of young and have us really focus on the example that it talks about. Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but here's where I want us to focus. But set an example for the believers in speech, in life, in love, in faith, and in purity. If we're able to set those examples for each other here and in the world around us, we are going to see amazing results for God. Not amazing results heaped upon us. Not great that we could end up in jail for things that we do. But amazing results for God. So I hope, as we've looked at Genesis 50 today, that we can see that we can have that same mind, that same attitude, and that same strength that Joseph shared with his brothers.